Good morning, and welcome to your morning cereal. Okay, good morning, and welcome to Tuesday. Well, I'm so sad to know just how far off my Super Bowl prediction was on yesterday's show. Obviously, having not yet watched the Super Bowl when the show was recorded, but the Super Bowl wasn't exciting. The Budweiser's Clydesdale didn't do anything that blew my mind, and Kelsey and Taylor are still together as far as I know. So I guess it's appropriate that today is National Don't Cry Over Spilled Milk Day. So let's just move on to bigger and brighter things like Happy National Armed Forces Day. Thank you to all of you that serve. And it's also National Make a Friend Day, so utilize all those personal growth actions and concepts that you're learning in the book review segment to make a new friend today. Here's a hint, start with a smile. Okay, let's just go ahead and jump right on into today's episode with today's quotes. One fun, nostalgic quote, and then a second quote to tease our book review later in the episode. Hopefully, one of these quotes will speak to you and jumpstart your day in a positive direction. The first quote is from George Lucas, and I love this quote of his because it's something I often tell myself when times get tough, and I often use it as a closer on this show. Here's what George said, quote, "You simply have to put one foot in front of the other and keep going. Put blinders on and plow right ahead," end quote. And George adds the blinders part of the quote to the end of it, which is right on. It speaks to having a focus of just trudging forward. It's a good addition to the saying. And today's teaser quote from the book review is, "Remember, you can measure the size of a person by what makes him or her angry," end quote. And as usual, we'll unpack that here in just a minute during our book review segment. But first, let's jump into our usual dose of fun and historic facts from this day in history. Today's news facts and birthdays are for February 11th. And on this day, back in 1847, American inventor Thomas Edison was born. He held a world record of over 1,000 patents at the time and played a critical role in introducing the modern age of electricity. In 1963, Julia Child's The French Chef, it debuted, and it was one of the first cooking shows on American television. I can just hear her voice. Then, in 1979, British politician Margaret Thatcher, she was elected as leader of the Conservative Party, becoming Europe's first woman prime minister. In 1990, after serving 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was released, which subsequently led to the ending of apartheid and the beginning of democracy in South Africa. Lastly, on this day in 2012, 13 years ago now, superstar singer Whitney Houston, she sadly passed away at the age of 48. We miss Whitney and we want to celebrate her life, and we also want to celebrate those with birthdays today. So happy birthday if today is your birthday. You share a birthday with a fairly good list today. Singer Khalid, he's 27 years old. And singer Kelly Rowland of Destiny's Child, she's 44. Singer Brandy, she's 46. Everybody's friend, Jennifer Aniston, she's 56 today. Singer Sheryl Crow, she's 63. And politician and brother of George W. Bush, Jeb Bush, he's 72 today. The number one song on this date back in 1985 was "I Want to Know What Love Is" by Foreigner. Now, if you ever made a love tape back in the 80s, this song was definitely on it. And the song is considered one of Foreigner's timeless classics. Check out Morning Cereal Podcast on Instagram for a clip of the song. And the number one movie in 1997 was Star Wars, the Special Edition. This was the re-release of the original Star Wars trilogy, celebrating their 20th anniversary. However, the re-release also allowed George Lucas to add some of the special effects to the movie that some special effect technology did not allow at the time of the original releases in the 70s and the 80s. Interestingly, George Lucas, he spent about $10 million on those changes to the original movies, which was roughly what it cost him to film the first movie in its entirety. The re-release allowed Lucas to keep his subscription to the Cheese of the Month Club, as it earned another $472 million worldwide at the box office. Let's go ahead and move on to some personal growth in the book review segment of Morning Cereal. This is where we take a few moments to reflect on lessons learned from the current book we're reading. And currently, we're reading through Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. As you all know, it's a timeless book that's consistently in all the must-read lists, and it's packed with rock-solid advice and actions for all of us to use and build healthy foundational concepts to live by. Well, we are in part 3 of How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is entitled How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. And we're finishing up chapter 1 today, which is entitled You Can't Win an Argument. And Carnegie is making the point that there are no winners in an argument because much of the time you haven't changed the other person's position. And you haven't made a friend out of them either. People want to feel important, and during an argument, people fulfill that need to feel important from within by wanting to win the argument. So we shouldn't argue, we should find common ground, find appreciation. If we give them that sense of importance, then they have nothing to argue about because now their mind is open and not necessarily defensive. Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "No man who is resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take the consequences, including the vitiation, the loss of his temper, and the loss of his self-control." End quote. To this point, Carnegie includes an excerpt from an article in Bits and Pieces that speaks to some suggestions on how to keep a disagreement from becoming an argument. Here, I'll walk us through those suggestions, beginning with welcome the disagreement. Sometimes disagreements come up, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. Quote, "When two partners are always agreeing, one of them is not necessary." End quote. Perhaps a disagreement will be a learning opportunity for you. Next, distrust your first instinctive impression. Now, this is not suggesting we ignore our instincts, but pointing out to us that sometimes in a disagreement, our human nature is to become defensive. And it's this defensive postures that we should be wary of. And be aware that, quote, "it may be you at your worst, not your best," end quote. Next is control your temper. Quote, "Remember, you can measure the size of a person by what makes him or her angry," end quote. Next is listen first. Give the other person the opportunity to talk without interrupting or being defensive, as those create barriers. Next is look for areas of agreement. After hearing the other person's perspective, look for and speak to the areas that you agree on first. Then, be honest. Acknowledge areas you are wrong and apologize for any mistakes, as this will help disarm and reduce defensiveness in the other person. Anecdotally, I've always found that personally for me, that simply admitting you're wrong when you are wrong can move mountains, and it creates a high level of credibility. Not that I'm admitting to a time that I've ever actually been wrong. So following being honest is promise to think over your opponent's ideas and study them carefully, and then actually do that. There's a chance that the other person is right. And if you push ahead with your agenda, then you might find yourself in a situation where the other person can say, quote, "I told you so." Then thank your opponents sincerely for their interest. If someone is taking the time to have a disagreement with you, then the two of you likely at least care about the same subject. Perhaps they really are trying to teach you something that could prove helpful, and you might make a new friend out of it. And then lastly, postpone action to give both sides time to think through the problem. Suggest that you circle up later that day or the next day to ensure you both have sufficient time to gather and think through all the facts. Then prepare for this next meeting by asking yourself some hard questions like, could they actually be right, or could they even be partially right? Is there any truth or merit to their position? How will my actions here reflect on me? Will it raise how people perceive me, or will it push people away? And what are the consequences if I win or lose? Well, that felt a little bit like rapid fire going through some of those great suggestions. So I'll repeat the primary ideas here to help our brains retain here on a Tuesday. First, welcome the disagreement. Then distrust your first instinctive impression. Then control your temper. Then listen first. Then look for areas of agreement. Then be honest. Then promise to think over your opponent's ideas and study them carefully. Then thank your opponent sincerely for their interest. And lastly, postpone action to give both sides time to think through the problem. Carnegie ends the first chapter of part 3 with a quick suggestion from a man that's been married for over 50 years, who said, quote, "My wife and I made a pact a long time ago, and we've kept to it no matter how angry we've grown with each other. When one of us yells, the other should listen. Because when two people yell, there is no communication, just noise and bad vibrations," end quote. Okay, Carnegie's principle number 1 in a chapter entitled "You Can't Win an Argument" is, the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. Most people don't like to argue anyways, and it's not great being around someone that does. Carnegie suggests to avoid arguing because it's a lose-lose situation. See if you can learn from the situation, and even if it matters. So again, principle number 1 is the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. All right, nicely done. We continue to make real progress in the book, and we're also making real progress in February. It's hard to believe it's already the 11th. But I hope what you're learning so far in the book is proving useful for you in your everyday life. I know it's been helpful for me. So be sure to join us again tomorrow as we begin chapter 2 of part 3, which is entitled "A Sure Way of Making Enemies" and How to Avoid It. I'm glad Carnegie made that a 2-part title. Well, if today is looking tough, remember what George and I both say. Keep on putting one foot in front of the other and keep moving forward in a focused and positive way. We've got your back. You can do it. Thanks for joining us today. Come back tomorrow and have a fantastic day. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the Morning Serial podcast on the One Life Live It channel. You can find more episodes and videos by visiting our YouTube channel and the website at Sean Inglis and at SeanInglis.com, where you can also follow our other podcasts, the Mr. and Mrs. Inglis podcast and the Life Happens podcast. In these other podcasts, we'll dive deeper into everyday issues, self-improvement and well-being, business and finance, and we welcome special guests too. So join us. It'll be a good time, I promise. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic day, and we'll see you tomorrow.